Hey there, curious minds. Welcome back to the deep dive. Some topics in history and theology, they've sparked endless discussions, even disagreements, really, for centuries. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the biggest, what the Bible actually tells us about the end times and, well, the mysterious book of Revelation. We've all encountered the traditional approaches, right? You think amillennialism, postmillennialism, historicism, premillennialism. These views often shape how we understand the timing and the nature of Christ's return, and is what the scriptures say, especially when you view them through the lens of, say, first century history.
Hmm.
We're kind of on a mission here to cut through some of the noise and see if there's something new, perhaps even overlooked, that needs considering.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is the humility this framework encourages. It's less about theological competition, and more about collective truth-seeking. Historically, even early church leaders grappled with revelation. Sometimes they were influenced by movements like Montanism, that was an early prophetic movement emphasizing immediate apocalyptic expectations and visions. This often led to interpretations that pushed events far into the future, potentially overlooking the New Testament's really urgent focus on the first century context, and specifically the impending punishment of Jerusalem. I mean, consider those incredible omens witnessed in AD 62 and AD 67, like celestial chariots and troops battling in the skies over the Second Temple, which tragically Jewish extremists took as a sign to go to war. And this ultimately led to Jerusalem's and the Second Temple's destruction by AD 70. That date, AD 70, is key, not later like AD 136, as sometimes cited for the final end of resistance. So this framework invites us to step back and re-examine those foundational interpretations, really grounding them firmly in the world of the original recipients.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our first approach, reconsidering the fourth kingdom of Bible prophecy. If you recall the book of Daniel, you have those incredible visions, the multi-metal statue, the terrifying beasts, each representing successive world empires, Babylon, Media-Persia, Greece. Right. But then we get to the mysterious fourth kingdom. Now, for centuries, Jewish tradition saw these as Gentile realms, and many interpretations today place Rome squarely in that final slot. But what if that traditional placement of Rome, well, presents a bit of a historical puzzle?
It absolutely does, yeah. While interpreting Rome as the fourth kingdom is common, it creates some significant problems with the biblical timeline. The Roman Empire, as an actual empire under Augustus Caesar, that only became a reality in 27 BC. Yet Israel's independence under the Maccabees, who fiercely resisted Greek encroachment, that occurred a full century earlier, 163 BC. So if we try to squeeze Rome's vast, complex, and incredibly long history, I mean, stretching over 2 millennia into the urgent warnings delivered to first century believers about their imminent end, it just creates a serious contradiction. The New Testament, it knows nothing of Rome's decline centuries later. It speaks to their present.
That's a really compelling point against Rome being the immediate focus for that judgment. So if we reevaluate Daniel's vision, where does this framework direct us instead? What makes this alternative a more fitting candidate for that mysterious fourth kingdom, especially for, a first century audience?
Well, the suggestion here is to reconsider the Fourth Kingdom not as some far-off Gentile empire, but actually as a Semitic phenomenon, specifically Judea itself. This perspective aligns far better with the biblical context and the immediacy of the New Testament warnings.
Judea itself.
Yeah, think about it. The Maccabean conquest against Greek dominance lasting from 163 to 37 BC, that could represent the Iron Dynasty. Then you have the Herodian dynasty, a blend of iron and clay, which lasted right up until the eve of Jerusalem's destruction. And finally, the Zealot Idumean factions formed this radical coalition, violently displacing Herod's grandson and the pro-Roman Jerusalem aristocracy in 66 AD. This internal Jewish group, not Rome initially, shockingly desecrated the Second Temple over the next 42 disaster-filled months until Rome finally intervened in 70 AD. This fulfills the stone-shattering prophecy against corrupted Jewish leadership within a directly relevant time frame. It positions Revelation's warnings within familiar Jewish settings and immediate events witnessed by early disciples rather than, postponing them indefinitely.
So the argument is this wasn't about a distant Gentile power, but more a self-destructive internal Jewish struggle culminating in judgment. That's a pretty significant reinterpretation. And it brings us directly to our second approach, those undeniable New Testament time statements. When Jesus and the apostles spoke, they frequently used phrases that conveyed incredible urgency. Phrases like, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass until all these things have happened." Finally, what did that mean for the original hearers, and how should we understand it today?
These consistent time indicators are absolutely crucial. Crucial for understanding the intended relevance of the prophecies. John the Baptist kicked it off pretty bluntly, scolding leaders to flee from the coming wrath. That's Matthew 3.7. Jesus himself emphasized it repeatedly. He said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." That's Matthew 16.28, and it's echoed in Luke and Mark too. And when warning about the coming devastation of Jerusalem, he explicitly stated, "This generation will certainly not pass until all these things have happened." Matthew 24.34.
This generation, yeah, that phrase has been debated for centuries, hasn't it? For many, it's often reinterpreted to mean some distant future generation, or maybe the Jewish people in general. But if we take it literally as a first-century statement to a first-century audience, well, it forces a different conclusion, doesn't it?
It really does. And the apostles, they reinforced this urgency. Peter pleaded, "Save yourselves from this corrupt generation." That's Acts 2.40. And Paul warned, "I'm going to do something in your days that you would never believe." Acts 13.41. This isn't about some distant future event for us, but about a defined, imminent era for them. This even informs Revelation 20, because Satan's binding and release, they have to align with Christ's words about the wicked spirit's expulsion and return in Matthew 12. It limits it to a specific historical era.
And there's even historical evidence from that exact time that seems to back this interpretation up, isn't there? I'm thinking about those reports of signs and omens you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. The context suggests actual visible conflicts happening in Judea's skies. Historians like Tacitus and Josephus, they recount eyewitnesses reporting phantom warring hosts and armies fighting in the sky with armor shining bright right above Jerusalem's second temple during that tribulation period, 66-70 AD. They also describe the temple lighting up with fire from clouds, doors opening by themselves, and a voice announcing that the gods were leaving. Wow.
Wow, that's right.
These dramatic public spectacles, they connect the Second Temple's downfall with intense, visible, otherworldly conflicts. It aligns perfectly with Revelation 12's description of Michael and the dragon's battle. This really anchors Revelation to the lifetimes of Christ's original apostles and earliest saints, rather than letting us postpone it indefinitely.
Those historical accounts, they truly bring the urgency of those New Testament time statements to life. It really makes you wonder what it must have been like to live through that time. Okay, our third approach zeroes in on the Second Temple, which in this framework emerges as the absolute epicenter of the events early Christians anticipated. Jesus himself prophesied a coming abomination of desolation. But here's where we challenge a really common assumption about who was truly responsible for that defilement.
Right. Many prevailing interpretations primarily blame Rome's 70 AD attack for destroying and defiling the Second Temple. However, Josephus, who was a historian right there at the time, he documents a significantly different story. He describes how extremist rebel zealot factions actually occupied the temple complex starting in 66 AD. This was soon after the Roman procurator Gessius Florus raided the temple treasury. These zealots rapidly turned the complex into a fortified base for civil warfare and, tragically, for massacring their opponents. Temple courts were filled with blood and bodies continuously for that grueling 42-month siege, a period Revelation 11 seems to mention as the trampling of the holy city. This went on until Rome finally suppressed the resistance and burnt the already dilapidated site. Rome, in fact, only needed about 2 days to destroy the derelict structure once it finally conquered the city.
So hold on. What you're saying is that the temple was already severely compromised and defiled before the Romans even finished the job. That really challenges the common narrative we often hear, which puts all the blame on Rome. How do you respond to those who might argue Rome's final destruction was the ultimate abomination?
That's a critical question, definitely. The ultimate act of judgment, the final destruction, certainly came through Rome. But the abomination itself, the defilement spoken of, was largely an internal corruption and desecration that happened before Rome's final blow. Even years before the Zealots took control, the Second Temple had this notorious reputation for greed, violence, and, well, underhandedness. There's even a tragic folk song preserved in Talmudic literature, The House of Cathros, which talks about the corruption of high priestly families, abusing their authority, nepotism, oppression, even slander. Yeah. And during his ministry, Jesus himself angrily overturned merchant tables, warning of the worst imaginable desecration awaiting that temple. The Zealots then, by barricading themselves inside the militarized temple, preventing anyone from exiting, they effectively sealed their own catastrophic fate. They held unfair trials, killed the innocent, threw bodies into the Kidron Valley. They, along with the Idumeans, massacred 8,500 worshippers in just one night.
8,500.
Exactly. This was the abomination of desolation unfolding, largely at the hands of Jewish groups, not solely the Romans initially, and false prophets promising miracles and freedom from Rome tragically lured hundreds of thousands of people into the city, only for them to become trapped behind fortified rebel walls. It tragically fulfilled Jesus' warnings.
That's a truly eye-opening perspective.
Mhm.
It really shifts who we attribute the abomination to, framing it as a profound internal tragedy first and foremost. Okay, now let's turn our attention to one of the most enigmatic figures in Revelation, Babylon the Great. For many people, this immediately conjures images of pagan Rome or maybe even the papacy later on.
Mhm.
But what if the identity of this mysterious entity hits much closer to home for that first century audience?
This approach argues very strongly that Babylon in the book of Revelation actually represents first century Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Yes. The key is to look closely at the specific accusations leveled against Babylon in Revelation 17, verses 1 to 6. These accusations bear striking similarities, even exact matches, to Jesus' own words condemning Jerusalem in Matthew 23, Luke 9, and Luke 11. Jerusalem had a unique covenant relationship with God, a history of promises and responsibilities, totally unlike pagan Rome, which wasn't accountable in that same specific covenantal way.
But I know for many listeners, that phrase, city on seven mountains in Revelation 17.9, is almost always exclusively associated with Rome. How does this Jerusalem as Babylon interpretation handle that iconic descriptor?
It's a very common and honestly understandable association, but it's important to remember that there are at least 24 other cities worldwide built on 7 hills. What sets Jerusalem apart and why it becomes the more compelling candidate in this view is that it also sits on 7 mountains: Mount Goth, Mount Gareb, Mount Akra, Mount Bezetha, Mount Zion, Mount Ophel, and Mount Moriah. And crucially, uniquely, it is accused of crimes against prophets, apostles, and saints. And it's explicitly stated to be where their Lord was crucified.
That's a point you can't make about Rome.
Exactly. Furthermore, if Babylon were Rome, we'd need historical evidence of Rome facing complete destruction by fire, with its military and religious institutions abolished simultaneously near the first century, as Revelation 18 and 19 describe. Such an event simply doesn't exist in historical records for Rome at that time. But in stark contrast, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's incredibly well documented by Josephus and aligns perfectly with these prophetic details. This perspective fundamentally shifts Revelation's meaning. It focuses it on God's judgment on the Old Covenant capital and signals the dramatic beginning of the New Covenant age.
That's a powerful and consistent thread you're weaving there, connecting Jerusalem to Babylon, tying it to that first century destruction. Okay, this brings us to our final approach, making sense of the intricate prophecies of Revelation 20, Satan's arrest, incarceration, release, and then the downfall of Gog and Magog. How do we make sense of these profound events without detaching them from everything we've just discussed about first century fulfillment?
Well, traditional views often do disconnect Revelation 20 from the previous chapters. That leads to inconsistencies and tends to push these events into a very distant, maybe even our future. This framework, however, aligns Revelation 20 with events following Rome's victory over the rebels at Masada in 73 AD. That event essentially marked the definitive end of the Jewish-Roman War. So Revelation 13 logically leads into Revelation 20 concerning the judgment of that fourth kingdom Judea and the transfer of authority to Christ. Satan's binding, described in Revelation 20.1-3, is seen as occurring after his symbolic defeat by Michael in Revelation 12 and the judgment on Jerusalem in Revelation 19. This explains that period of relative peace in Judea from about 7132 AD as a time of Satan's confinement. A time when the gospel could spread more freely, unhindered by the direct, targeted persecution from that specific Old Covenant system.
Okay, so if Satan was bound during that period of relative peace, what triggers his release, which is described as a brief but intense period of deception and rebellion?
The release of Satan, described in Revelation 20, verse 7, is strongly identified here with the devastating Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 AD. After Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD, there was no major Jewish revolt in Judea itself until Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva, a very prominent Jewish leader at the time, proclaimed this Simon Bar Kokhba as Messiah, launching a massive revolt. And this wasn't just a minor skirmish, it was huge. It was over Roman policies like backtracking on rebuilding the temple, Emperor Hadrian's ban on circumcision, and the renaming of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. Tragically, Jewish leaders repeated their mistake from 66-70 AD. They again rejected Jesus as Messiah for a militaristic pretender. Bar Kokhba even ordered the persecution of the burgeoning Christian community because they failed to support his revolt, seeing them as disloyal. And in an act that Josephus records as just amazing blasphemy, Bar Kokhba essentially told God to stand back, claiming the Hebrews no longer wanted divine help, that they could achieve victory on their own.
That's an incredible detail, almost a mirror image of the earlier zealot actions, that kind of self-reliance against God. So this revolt, led by Bar Kokhba, and interpreted here as Satan's brief release, that represents the Gog and Magog rebellion mentioned in Revelation 20.
Precisely. This revolt strongly matches Revelation 20.710's description of Satan's brief release to deceive the nations. Gog and Magog here are seen as representing those leadership elites who manipulate popular sentiment through, religious nationalism, and they specifically targeted the camp of the saints, which means the Jerusalem church and the wider Christian community at that time. Bar Kokhba initially had stunning success. He destroyed 5 Roman legions, an incredible feat.
5 legions.
Oh, yeah. But both scripture and rabbinic accounts report total, crushing defeat by Hadrian's overwhelming retaliation, which brought immense suffering to the Jewish people. This calamity, from this framework's perspective, represented a pointed discipline, partly for Judaism's murderous persecution of the early church during that revolt. But crucially, divine protection ensured the fledgling church survived this malicious onslaught. It truly was, you could say, a last gasp Herculean attempt to destroy the church, the gospel, and the kingdom of God, ensuring the new covenant would flourish instead.
Wow, what a truly deep and definitely thought-provoking dive into biblical prophecy. We've really peeled back layers of interpretation here. We've explored the argument that Daniel's 4th kingdom was Judea, not Rome, aligning with those urgent time statements for that first-century generation. We've seen how the Second Temple became the epicenter of a terrifying abomination, primarily at the hands of internal zealots, not solely the Romans. We've re-examined Babylon the Great, finding compelling reasons to identify it with first-century Jerusalem, matching Christ's own indictments. And finally, we've connected Revelation 20's prophecies, Satan's release, the Gog and Magog rebellion, directly to the devastating Bar Kokhba revolt.
These insights, they really do challenge foundational ideas in many of the traditional 4 views, don't they? They invite a humble, maybe a prayerful, reassessment in light of both scripture and the historical record. If we consider Judea's great but ultimately disastrous zealot insurrections, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt as pivotal moments of prophetic fulfillment, well, it has serious implications for how we research, study, and interpret New Testament eschatology. And it raises an important question, I think. What if acknowledging these specific historical fulfillments helps us understand the overarching narrative of redemption and the establishment of the new covenant with far greater clarity and immediacy?
Absolutely. A lot to think about there. So what stands out to you listening right now from this deep dive into understanding biblical prophecy? How might these historical connections shift your own perspective on what the Bible said would happen real soon for its original audience? We really encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with these incredibly rich texts. There's always more to learn.